number 9 is the first substantive item on the agenda, the evaluation of Auckland Council local government elections 2019. Welcome Warwick McNaughton and Rose Leonard to the table and ask them to give a presentation followed by questions and comment.
Thank you, Your Worship and councillors. I'd just like to make a few brief points before your questions. Firstly, just to acknowledge some members may feel uncomfortable discussing elections because you're also participants. This is an issue that has been mentioned before. I'd just point out that Auckland Council itself does have a legislative role to appoint an electoral officer who's responsible for the conduct of the elections, and the council is required to provide the required funding. So it's quite valid for the governing body to evaluate the success of the elections and consider improvements for the future. And in this respect, we're taking notes of all the comments that you make that could lead to future improvements. I'd also just like to note that in a report of this nature, it's actually very difficult, or it's not possible to adequately convey all the activities that took place in presenting the local elections, or all of the detail. It's a major undertaking, a major project, a lot of activity on a day-to-day basis. One example of the detail is around the one-stop shops. Overall, the feedback that we have received is that they were very successful, but we ran out of voting documents. Now, some of the detail around this is to do with the intricacies of how people in different areas receive different voting packs. There are 68 different permutations of voting packs across the whole Auckland Council area for residential electors. It was logistically difficult to provide all of them at all one-stop shops. We concentrated on stocking special voting packs for the area the one-stop shop was in, but more people than we anticipated came from out of area. So that's a learning for us for next time. The innovations that we've noted in the report include, apart from the one-stop shops, we held a candidate webinar, which was the first time. Vote Friday, we engaged community partners to assist us with our engagement with the community. And there were things that we did last time and we improved upon this time, such as the youth voting program, with candidate evenings at schools hosted by school students. We had an improved web portal for candidates and voters and an improved pre-election report. Touching on the detail again, just note that at one of the schools, Manariwa High School, the candidate event had to be cancelled due to the measles outbreak. The research that has been conducted will continue to inform our approach going forward. And one interesting aspect of the behavioural insight study is that messages expressing concern about turnouts actually puts voters off, whereas messages which positively encourage people to take part are more effective, and you'll be receiving a more thorough presentation about the behavioural insights study that was done next week. The voter awareness survey asked people why they did not vote. Some of the responses indicate an intention to vote, but procrastination overcame good intentions. And some people who did not vote partly completed their voting documents but did not get to the point of posting their vote. The matter of voter turnouts addressed further in the next report on the submission to the Justice Committee. But in brief, any changes that make the voter experience simpler and give the voter options for how they lodge their vote could make a positive difference. But at the root of it all, there's very probably an issue to do with people's lack of engagement with their local council. Also, just to note that Auckland Council is supporting the joint LGNZ Solgum Modernising Elections project. And to finish off, just to point out that in terms of the evaluation contained in the report, the intention is to simply receive the report, but the report notes that leading up to an election, there are a number of decisions that the council has the opportunity to make, And so we have included recommendations that are there to test your appetite as to whether you want these matters reported to you for the 2022 elections. The recommendations are made in the negative that because you already have a position on things like STV and Māori wards, that we just stay with the current position, and because there isn't a requirement for us to conduct a review of representation arrangements for 2022, then we don't. Having said that there's a wide range of activities that occur with running elections, Rose and I are not necessarily able to be across all the detail, and there are other staff here that may be able to assist us with your questions.
Thank you very much, Warwick. Rose, anything you wanted to add at this stage? To get the recommendations on the board, I'll move accordingly. Have I got a seconder for that? Councillor Cooper. Just to note before we go into questions, there is quite a lot of overlap between this item and item 10, and stuff that we want to relay to the government is most appropriate to do under item 10 rather than item 9. Secondly, there are two sections to this. One, we've got a series of recommendations here about what we will or won't do, but we're also receiving information about the achievement of the outcomes sought. So discussion may be around both of those areas, but let's begin by opening it up for questions. And I have a question first of all from Councillor Linda Cooper.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So mine's around paragraph 52, and we say it was about having the boxes in the libraries, etc., and you say it went well. Maybe it did, but I think I'd really like to interrogate that, because my anecdotal evidence on the day of the election, people ringing me going, oh my God, the boxes are full, and the librarians are telling me to go to another library, and there were no spare boxes. People were queuing to put the envelope in, and some of them, this is at the Westgate Library in Henderson, people couldn't get the envelope in the box, so some of them just never got to vote and couldn't get to the other places in time, because of course people leave it to the last minute. And so that was an issue that our poor librarians, probably, it's not their fault, but I think for me is, if we're going to do this again, I think it's fantastic because it's a pseudo voting day, and that seems to work better, but that's for the next item. But to me, have we got some sort of way we can say, okay, we've got a big pile of boxes you can make up all ready to go. If that's full, you can just whack another box up if you've got people standing there with their papers.
Question?
Thank you, Your Worship. One comment is that this adds to the thought that what people prefer is a number of different options for how they vote. And along with the one-stop shops, having the ballot boxes in libraries was very popular and more popular than we anticipated. So that's a learning for next time.
Just in terms of the legality of it, is that who's responsible? So we've always got our poor librarians seem to take on so many roles and get yelled at and all the rest of it. Who would be responsible for making sure there were more boxes and those boxes are taken away? Is it the librarians, or are there actual staff from election services or whatever there? Because that's my biggest concern, that we don't resource it enough.
Whose responsibility? Well, something that happens on a 3-yearly basis is the setting up of quite a major project and the engagement of a project team with a proper project manager. That project has completed and those people are not with us anymore.
Next time.
Yeah, next time.
Yeah,
that's
next time it is that election team. I'm taking notes, so that election team will make sure that they are able to support the librarians with additional boxes.
Yeah, but I'm trying to understand. We pay election services to run our election, but we also then, is this right, we have a bunch of people employed by council to do a whole lot of, increasing voter turnout. So is it that group that are responsible for the actual boxes, or is it election services? Because for me, it's about what we tell the people we employ, the company we employ to do it, or do we talk to the group of people we employ on that 3-yearly basis? That's what I want to understand. It's not a criticism, it's just...
Yes. I think the correct answer to that is it's not a black and white division of responsibilities. There are a number of meetings held throughout the whole, not through the cracks. It's a collaborative effort. The electoral officer has to be on the returning end when those ballot boxes close at 12 noon on polling day and they're brought back to his office. Our own staff assist with getting them out to the libraries.
No, I understand. Thank you. Thanks very much. That was very good.
Thank you very much. Councillor Darby.
Thanks, Mayor. Thanks, Warwick and Rose. This is titled an evaluation of the elections, and then I look at the motions, and I can't see the political resolution reflecting anything of the evaluation. And I look at the evaluation and I home in on turnout. So if I asked you, in your evaluation of turnout at 35.3%, on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being of really high concern and 1 low concern, where are we in terms of an evaluation of turnout? I mean, we're talking about democracy is about the whole of the population, the whole of the people participating. And it worries me that in this evaluation, we're not homing into a really serious problem of low voter turnout. So in terms of 1 to 5, how serious is the problem we've got in terms of our whole democratic process? Because you actually said, I wrote it down, it was interesting. People's lack of engagement with their council is the root of it all.
Yeah.
Sorry, I think it's a serious problem. That's a serious question.
It's a serious question. I don't want to trivialise it, but I think if 5 is a major concern, then I'd put it at a 6. It is a significant concern, low voter turnout.
So it's off the scale. You're saying it's off the scale serious.
It's something that the country as a whole needs to address, and hence our support for the joint project being undertaken by LGNZ and Solomon.
Chair, maybe there's more questions probably in the next report, yes. But because they do cross over, so I'll leave it there for now.
If I can just make a comment that unfortunately for the next item, we've got a deadline to send the submission in, but I would like to see a greater focus on the non-vote. I think all of us around this table regard that as serious. And what I have asked for next Monday at the All Councillors meeting up on the 27th floor is to get the REMU team in to hear a greater exposition of what their findings were, and to get from councillors, and we'll partly do this today, a sense of the things that we might be asking government to focus on in terms of how we might improve that vote. And there's, I think everybody would agree, there's no silver bullet answer. There's a whole lot of things. The voting system's part of it, but you know, online voting, yeah, we have to do that. But in Canada, it increased the vote by 2%. You know, that would take us to 37, still not good enough. So I think it's a wider examination of that and informing whoever represents us down at Wellington before the Select Committee of what we should most be asking central government for in order to address this problem. But it won't be simple, and it won't just be about the voting system. It will be about a range of issues. Councillor Casey.
I want to have some discussion about the Māori ward. In particular, Warwick, I'd like you to tell us about the petitions that have stopped 5 councils from having a Māori ward, the cost of that, and just your experience of what you know about it. Which councils, for example? I've got another couple of questions after that.
Thank you. I don't have the list in front of me. I remember Palmerston North was one. Prior to the 2019 elections, another one was New Plymouth, and it was the Mayor of New Plymouth who presented the petition to the committee. The process, if the council resolves to establish a Māori ward, there's a provision for a petition. I think it's from 5% of electors for a referendum. A referendum is conducted. which was the case with those 5 councils. And I believe that Hobson's pledge was very active in getting people involved in that referendum. And the referendums in those 5 cases overturned the council decisions.
So just on that, you heard Richard Northey talk about the submission from the Waitemata Local Board seeking an amendment. This might be in the next section, but it could also be in this section, seeking a legislative amendment to abolish that provision. What's your view of that?
To a large extent, the discussion around this is highly political, I think, rather than officer-driven. But to my mind, the current provision is anomalous. The issue really is to do with the nature of democracy itself. It's the best system we've got, but it is the rule of the majority, and the majority wins. And this is a process for allowing our treaty partner to have some representation at the council table. To put that process to a referendum of the majority just seems anomalous.
Good answer, Warwick. Do you think that if we decide today to seek a legislative amendment that would allow us to consider a Maori seat in 2025, which would mean a decision around 2023, that there would be some further engagement in Auckland from the populace, including Maori?
I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that. If it went to the process being proposed by Waitemata Local Board, then there would be the engagement through the review of
Is
representation
that what I mean?
arrangements. Yes.
Yeah.
Oh,
So if
they're
we're looking
bound
for
be
ways to
very active
engage, that would
engagement.
be one.
Yes.
Thank you.
Right, Councillor Pipacoon.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, tēnā kouroua. Actually, I'd like to start with a procedural question, if I may, Mr. Mayor, that's related to Councillor Darby's query, just about, in terms of the evaluation and the successful elements of the election that worked, is no political direction needed to ensure that those happen again next time? Because I would have thought we would be saying, for example, you know, the one-stop shops were fabulous and we should absolutely make sure that they happen again. Or how are they going to happen if we don't give that direction?
Yeah, as a matter of common sense, what worked this time, I'm assuming everybody would want to repeat next time. I'm not sure that we need a formal resolution to direct our officers because everybody accepts that let's look at what was good. It didn't achieve what we wanted, but it was helpful and it was positively received. I'd like us to go further than what we did this time, and that would include, you know, the concept of having your ballot boxes outside your supermarkets, outside your Pacifica churches on a Sunday, all of those things, anything that make it easier for people to participate in the democratic process within the reasons of financial constraints, we should be looking at to try to increase that. But I don't think we need a formal resolution at this stage. I do think we need further discussion on it, and Monday may be an opportunity for us to canvass a range of solutions and try to prioritise what we think is most important in terms of getting that bigger turnout.
Okay, I think that's the reassurance I just wanted, because I wouldn't like all the good work that was done to kind of get lost if in 3 years' time we have different people on the ground who weren't familiar with what happened. So I did just have 2 questions, if I may. One was actually about the one-stop shops, which I just thought were fantastic, and we know that they brought out a whole lot of people who hadn't voted before. But I understand that there was a police complaint about them, because I think there was a bit of misunderstanding that they didn't fall within the central government style election rules. Are you aware if that got pursued or anything has come of that?
A complaint about the conduct of the elections would go to the electoral officer, who would be obliged under the Local Electoral Act to forward it to the police. The police have not made us aware of any complaint of that nature.
Okay, it was probably just some hot air. But and the second question I had, I mean, there's obviously a lot of debate around online voting and the security of it. And I've sat in a presentation from the head of GCSB who has said, do not go anywhere near it. But putting that aside, and yes, it does seem like a popular option, there's some very compelling research that's coming out of, the AUT have done that actually shows that online voting, it's that the way you vote is not the barrier to increasing voting turnout. So, where it has been introduced online voting and you've got the choice, it's the same people who would vote. They might just choose to do it online. And interestingly, fewer young people will choose online voting because they really appreciate the security issue. So the question I had was, yes, it's great to be updated by REMU and their research and the feedback they got from a sample, but are we also looking at what's coming out of, research, for example, out of the Policy Institute, out of AUT, and what they're saying about what are actually the barriers to voting?
Just to comment, Joyce, upon the online voting aspect, we were aware that in Canada there's 150 municipalities who conduct elections online. We had a Skype meeting with Nicole Goodman, who's a social scientist over there, who's taken an interest in online voting. Her assessment was that it increased turnout by about 2 to 3%. And your description of it is correct. It makes it more convenient for those who vote. It's not the game changer to increase the turnout.
So we are going to get that kind of research feedback in terms of ongoing discussion?
Yeah, we do get the research that the universities do. We do receive copies of that. I'm aware of some research being conducted by an academic in Massey as well as AUT that's along the lines that there should be, that local government candidates should be more in terms of political parties. The whole political party thing should be brought more into local government so that people know what they're voting for. There are a lot of studies being done. Yeah.
I think the information we received on online voting is the critical reason for it is that our postal system will incredibly fail to deliver. It won't be because we'll get a massive turnaround and turnout, but simply as fewer and fewer people use the postal system, it becomes less and less regular and reliable and fit for purpose. But I would like, depending on what councillors say today and on Monday, I think it may well be worth a follow-up workshop just to get the widest range of feedback on voting turnout and the reason for poor voting turnout. I've had this discussion with Councillor Darby before, and I think we both agree that this is something we tend to look at the time of the election, say that's terrible that it's so low, and then life goes on and we have another election. I think we need to look at some of the more fundamental and underlying reasons for low turnout, which basically are things, in my view, like, well, we didn't know the candidates, and by the time we got to the District Health Board, we kind of gave up. Maybe that's why 25% didn't vote after starting to. And secondly, whether it makes any difference is the question. And partly that's because central government tends to be the determinant of many policy directions with limited devolution of authority to local government. I think you've actually got to look at those sort of fundamental issues. But sorry, that's something I think we need collectively to look at. Councillor Bartley.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Warwick and Rose, for the report. I don't know if I want to encourage any more voting because I got in, so unless those votes are for me. But no, I'm just joking. I loved the one-stop shop. Those were awesome, especially in my community where we have high transients. So there were a lot of specials that needed to be taken, and that was the best option for people, was to go to the night markets. But I did want to question the voter awareness survey because I'm worried about it. And Richard Northey referenced that people want to see more online voting, but I just don't think that's an adequate enough statement to make, given that it was made by people who were online. The survey was online, so of course people are going to say online is the better option for me because they're online. Is there any way to make, to survey again, if not survey again, but for it to be a bit more robust? Because I can only take this with a grain of salt. I'm not going to use that as a statement that that's what people want to see.
Hi, good morning. Through the chair, yes, good question. I guess with any sort of research, there is going to be biases, and the online bias is something that we couldn't get away from this time. So, look, as much as we try to get a representative sample, there is going to be that bias of online. So you're absolutely right. I can't quantify exactly what that bias is, but we can look at other forms of research that tries to incorporate the non-online as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Newman.
Yes, thank you, Warwick. I was very pleased with the contribution that the one-stop shops made to providing ease of voting for people who would probably not otherwise vote. But one of the questions that I had is that the report doesn't make any comment in terms of staff perception of conduct. My concern, and it is only anecdotal, but I think it's a fair point to raise, is the need to ensure the conduct of candidates and people supporting candidates around or adjacent to one-stop shops. They are places that need to be controlled, and they need to, the solemnity of the moment needs to be upheld by people involved in elections, not aggressively or overtly campaigning and directing people at the one-stop shop or close to it. If you have a one-stop shop, they need to be places where people can vote unfettered by direct campaigning at the moment that they do vote. Your report doesn't address that, that's fine, but I think that there does need to be some reflection in the future about how one-stop shops will be complemented by a proper protocol when it comes to campaigning adjacent. You might wish to comment, maybe not, but I would like those my reflections to be recorded.
My comment on that would be that we were aware of a couple of instances. We were able to exert some influence where the area we were able to control, but outside the area that we could control, it becomes difficult. But clearly, the one-stop shop event is a voting event, and potential voters should not be curtailed or campaigned as they enter the premises.
Can I just follow up on that, Your Worship? I think this is a very important point, and I do think in preparation for the future, because I see the move to, I think with the general election this year, there will be a lot of early voting. Advanced voting will be huge.
And at supermarkets.
Yes. And so that, I think, provides some scope for increasing turnout for local government elections in the future as more people get used to voting early. If that's to happen and we continue to roll out the one-stop shops, then they need to be designed in a way which absolutely ensures that the one-stop shops are places for voting and not places for campaigning, and that people who are campaigning adjacent have no business being there, because people need to make their decisions unencumbered by the conduct of others.
Okay.
I think those points well made. Do you want to comment further on that? I'll get you to just turn that mic off too, if I could, please, Warwick. Councillor Wayne Walker.
So I really just want to endorse the comments that my fellow councillor Daniel Newman was making. I received the same anecdotal evidence, and some of it was pretty serious in terms of what I heard. I would suggest that there's a parallel between the one-stop shops and also the voting that was encouraged in places of work, okay, police and so on. Now, it wasn't possible to go into the New Zealand Police as a candidate and be present, or for that matter, any of the other workplaces. What is different between that and the University of Auckland, which is a workplace? It also happens to be a place where students go and the like. So I think if we've got a set of principles, those principles need to be applied across the board, because we know in advance that some of those locations, irrespective of whether it is a workplace or a university or the like, have particular demographics that may be more relevant to some people seeking election than others. For example, you could have a one-stop shop at a location where there were a lot of old people, senior people, and there could be some senior candidates, relative to another location which was the opposite, and so on. So it's absolutely obvious that if you've got candidates there and they are visible, then you're going to have a result that I would suggest is incredibly predictable. Unfortunately, we're not in a position to measure that because we don't have the information around how somebody voted. But if you did an exit poll, then that's possible. And I know in other countries and so on that they do exit polls, and there is useful information that is gained by that. So maybe that's something that we need to look at.
Councillor, I'll take that on board. I've already acknowledged that I think that's a point, but this is questions at the moment. Otherwise, we're going to get people having two bites of the cherry.
The other question that I've got just goes around to our market research, our surveying. We do this voter awareness survey, but do we do surveys or contemplate them for the underlying reasons why people aren't voting?
Through the chair, yes, we have done surveys as to why people don't. Included in that voter awareness piece, there is breakdowns as to why people say they don't vote. Now, it is perceptual, but there are the reasons outlined within that report. Happy to take you through that in more detail.
So if I apply that to Auckland, and we all know that Auckland structurally in terms of voting and the like is quite different to anywhere else in Auckland. We've got CCOs, we've got local boards, we've got a mayor that's elected at large with a special department, we've got a whole lot of things. Do we measure the level of awareness that people have about our structure, their understanding and the like? Do we measure any of that? Do they actually know? Because my anecdotal response was that generally when I approached people, they didn't know. But I'd like to know whether we're measuring any of that.
The short answer is yes, in separate surveys and separate projects, not within the same remit as what we're asking in the voter awareness, but your general sentiment is correct.
Okay, got a further question. Do you think that there's a relationship between the voter turnout and people's awareness of council and what council does and what the various roles are? Is there a relationship with civic activities that we might have and so on? People's opportunity to engage locally at places where they might congregate? If you like, the sorts of things that would be part of a civic strategy that might include civic education, for example, that other jurisdictions and other countries have. Would there be a relationship there?
Okay, we've got the question. Thank you.
Yes, I think there is a relationship. I think one of the biggest barriers that showed from the research was around relevancy, so how we make council relevant to people and their decision making and all that sort of stuff. But yes, there is a relationship, you're right.
Councillor
I have a question of Warwick.
So, sorry, can we make this the last one, please, Councillor, because I've got a long list of other questioners.
This is the last question, and it's the issue going forward. You've said on a scale of 1 to 5 in terms of importance that this is a 6. So, I mean, that's an emergency as far as the general principles that we apply. What do we need to do going forward to address What I'm establishing are a range of general issues and a circumstance that's getting progressively worse.
It's a $60,000 question, I think. We've tried to forward some suggestions in the submission, which is the next item, but generally an approach which makes the whole voter experience easier, less complicated and confusing, that's got to be good. But that doesn't address the issues you've raised about engagement.
How do we deal with them?
Councillor, I really need to move on to other questions now. Councillor Desley Simpson.
Thank you, Your Worship. Two quick questions, one to you and one to Warwick. So this is a very bad return on our investment. So my question to you is, and I think you've alluded to it, but I just want to be absolutely clear that you're going to give the governing body an opportunity to input into procedures, policies and way council operates to help make a greater awareness of who we are and what we do, which was one of the problems identified in this report, but why people weren't voting. Is that correct? Because if you keep doing the same thing and you throw more money in it and you're still not getting a good result, I think that's the definition of insanity. So you're saying that you're going to do something on Monday and then potentially have a workshop, is that correct?
That's the proposal that we've certainly got Monday arranged and I think foreshadowed to councillors. I think we might want to go beyond that, depending on what the discussion leads to say we need to workshop some of these things, and we need to come up with, I think, probably a stronger and clearer presentation of issues of what changes we want in order to produce a change in the turnout. Yep. And I'm not saying that to say there's an easy solution, there isn't, but we would be remiss in our responsibilities if we didn't address it, question it, interrogate it, and put something through to government that we think would lead to a higher level of participation in democracy at our level.
So thank you. I think whilst this is academic on our relationship and what we're going to do legislatively, I think there's a lot of work that we can do in our own space, because we do nothing for 2.5 years, put all the resource and then do this and find out it doesn't work. So that's that point. My question to Warwick is, the one-stop shop, very successful. It's very close to being a polling booth, other than not having a place to fill it in. And is there any possibility that all the rules that apply to a polling booth could apply to a one-stop shop?
Our current legislation, the Local Electoral Act, carries over some of the rules which are historic, so that on polling day there are some rules as far as I know, but in fact our polling day is about 3 weeks. And really the key rule there is the rule about coercion. It's an offence to coerce anybody into how they should vote. And we can rely on that rule to cut a lot of this behaviour off. If it continues, it's referred to the police.
Have you got any idea what the resourcing cost will be for that? Because you're not talking about one day here, you're talking about 3 weeks, and we're asking for probably more opportunities in a one-stop shop than would there be polling booths, or would they be about the same?
I'm not aware that we got specific complaints about coercion in regard to the one-stop shops. I experienced one complaint for the 2016 elections on polling day itself. I was in the electoral officer's office. He received a complaint that there was a certain gentleman outside one of our centres, which has ballot boxes, intercepting people as they went in to lodge their vote. So the electoral officer contacted the campaign leader, said to him, you better call him off. It's not a lot of resource.
I think if I can just ask a supplementary, it's not simply about coercion. That's obviously absolutely wrong, criminal, illegal. It's about improperly influencing a person in close proximity to a polling place. And I think we'd need to look at the rules around that. I don't think it's appropriate for a candidate, whoever that person might be, to actually be holding up banners right adjacent to a place where people are actually casting their votes. So I think maybe we need to look beyond the coercion to, I know on election day for general elections, a candidate doesn't go near a polling booth, and the same rule should apply, I think, for local government for the polling booths as it does to the central government. Thank you. I won't go there, Councillor. Councillor.
Yeah, thank you. I guess a few comments and then questions, and I guess it comes on to the next item too. For me, my opinion is the whole system is broken, and it's been broken for a long time, and we keep doing the same thing, or even though with all the effort, energy, passion that you and your staff and everyone went through the elections, we still didn't move. In fact, we went backwards. So there's a few things. The first thing, New Zealand government spends $100 million on the election, for the central government election, on advertising, on getting people enrolled and sending people out there. We spend, about 2 million? So we spent 2% of a budget for over 1/3 of the country for a much more complicated, far more candidates, far more complex system. We're asking people to, in central government, to do 2 ticks on a pretty simple system, and we spend as a country over $100 million on that. So do we have our spending right? Are we being too, are we putting a price on democracy that fits inside a special budget? Because I heard more advertising of employing volunteers or workers for this year's election, during so I heard radio advertising. Instead of that radio advertising being enroll, vote, blah, 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 the radio advertising was asking for workers for this year's general election. So where is the support from government, or where is the strategy as a whole? Because I feel like if they had that funding, they would have been enrolling people last year for both elections and getting a double win out of that. So for me, I think we're being a bit Scrooge, or there needs to be a look at the overall thing. I guess the next option for me, where's the big stuff? Why aren't we saying we want a 4-year term? We want to jam everything into one election. Where's the booths? Nothing's working, and we keep pretending it's okay. But I don't think it's also your guys' fault. It's also our fault. So we spend 3 years smashing each other apart and saying how terrible Auckland Council is, and then expect people to vote for it. And the other thing is that I want to know about the 3-year plan, not just the election plan. So for Auckland Council, we don't get the support, and I'm not saying it's all about us as candidates or politicians, but the political parties get massive budgets every year to send out letters to their constituents, to put out newsletters, to put up public meetings. We find it hard to even turn up to some of our public meetings. So how is that? Is there a problem?
We'll call that a question. I'm not questioning the validity, Councillor, but probably a whole lot of us have merged from questions into comment. You're asking for some feedback from our officers on that. So Warwick.
It was a couple of questions, and to be fair, Councillor Watson, plenty of other people have spoken a lot more than me.
Yep. Councillor Walker, I think. Okay. Can I look? Sorry. Order. I think we just get on. We're taking a long time over this. It's important, but let's keep focused. Warwick, have you got any comment on the questions posed by Councillor Hills?
The overall theme in the questions, I think, was to do with the relationship between local government and central government and how it compares, and that's really a subject for the next item and the proposal for the Electoral Commission to conduct our elections. But you're correct, it's more than 2 million. If you look under the financial implications at the end of the report, you'll see the year-to-date amount. We expect that after all the wrap-up and the recoveries are in, it's going to be about 5.6.
Thank you. Councillor Fletcher.
Thank you, Worship. To a degree, my question was asked by Daniel Newman, and for me it was around the probity issues and the integrity of the process to ensure adequate separation between campaigning and actual voting. And I think we're all agreed we're going to deal with that. You have allowed others to indulge in terms of questions that might veer into the next agenda item. Mine is the specific issue of postal ballots. It's been a sensitive issue. It's one that we've observed for a long time. If I go right back to my parliamentary career, we looked at it with Electoral Law Select Committee. We've looked at it in legacy councils, and we have discussed it. Warwick, what I'd like you to comment on is, I am often told when I ask people why they don't vote, oh, we were waiting for voting day, because they somehow assume that it will be like central government elections and there will be a voting day. The second thing that I hear is that, oh, it's a postal ballot, it's less important. So we create this perception or myth that somehow local government's less important than central government because you don't have to get around to going into a polling booth on election day. There are multiple arguments in this. I know that the response in the past has been, well, postal ballots were introduced to increase voter turnout, but I would like you to give us the facts on what has happened to voter turnout since the introduction of postal ballots, because I think these issues we will deal with perhaps next Monday with the Mayor, and we will deal with them in the next agenda item, but they are a contributing they are contributing to further confusion where there are different voting systems. So I know that Councillor Northey, Member Northey and I have debated this over many years, but I am not persuaded that postal ballots have increased voter turnout.
Okay, that's a very good question. Do you, with the assistance of Chair Northey, have the answer to that question?
Well, perhaps while he's thinking, there is quite a bit of history in this. There was a time when it was, I think it was optional. It became mandatory for councils to use postal voting in the early 1990s, and then the law was changed to make it optional again. Hutt City went back to booth voting, and their turnout dropped. So they reverted to postal voting, and all councils have used postal voting since. I don't have turnout figures to give you.
Can you provide those before Monday for us, please?
Yes.
I would be interested in the Legacy Council areas, the now unified Auckland Council, and those voter turnout details and since that time, and with the assistance of Chair Northey giving the officers their answers, it would be really helpful to have that information.
When I was first
use the mic, please, Richard.
When I was first elected to the Auckland City Council in 1979, was the last election with ballot boxes, and I was elected and the turnout was 9%. It's election day does for you.
Thank you.
I don't wish to see this politicised. I'd just like to actually see the evidence. Thank you.
I think, again, just a very brief comment that what we've talked about is a multimodal approach, and it may be that 4 weeks is too long for postal votes. People think they've got plenty of time and then they leave it to the end and then they don't do it. It may be that we put more emphasis on having a polling place on the Friday and Saturday of election, and it may be that we can bring in online voting to supplement. So I think the answer, it's a very fair question. The answer may lie with a combination of those things, and that's what we could consider. Councillor Shane Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, but it's more of a comment. Should I come back to it later, or we've got
why don't we
some mixture?
Like everybody else's, if you can get to the question reasonably quickly with keeping the comment short.
A couple of points, but I'll try and keep it short. I think that talking about booth voting versus postal is a totally false dichotomy. The reality is we have booth voting right now. The libraries are booth votes. The issue that I have with that is there was inadequate signage for the libraries, there was inadequate promotion for the libraries, in my view. In some cases, the ballot box wasn't even on the table. You had to ask the librarian for that. So we have booth voting. So we're talking about the merits of it. We can talk about our actual experiences. To expand the booths through supermarkets, those kind of things, I think is a great idea. I don't think we should be caught up on the cost of this. I think we can have booth voting for a weekend or even a day. It doesn't need to be the 3 weeks necessarily. Just on online voting, I think sometimes there is an assumption that it's an inevitable march to progress, given that we've talked about, online world is changing and growing with us. But that's not true necessarily. I would just urge my colleagues to look at the security and the logistics of online voting and make that decision in isolation. See if it's good for us. I do have a question in here. Online one-stop shops. So I wanted to talk about some of the points that have been raised, and just to point out that relying on coercion, you would have to rely on a fairly wide definition of what coercion is. And I would suggest that people setting up booths nearby a one-stop shop voting place is not coercion, in my view. That is merely providing information. Coercion is actually pulling people out and saying, go vote. So I'm not suggesting that any of this is right or anything like that. I am suggesting that we need advice on this, and whether that is a legislative change or whether we can handle it through bylaws or policies. We need to look at the options that we have to prevent the sort of concerns that have been raised here. Finally, regarding postal ballots, I wanted to point out that there are entire suburbs in Waitakere that have no post boxes at all. Sunnyvale is one of them, I know. I'm surprised that we got to a position in the 2019 elections where we saw New Zealand Post ripping out ballot boxes everywhere, and we didn't really respond to it. So I'd like your views on those points.
Right, you might like to take some rather than all of them.
Look, we agree with the comments about the decline in the postal service and the challenges that prevents us. I mean, that was the whole, not the whole, but it was a very significant reason for us looking into online voting for the 2019 elections. In terms of the comments around, if we're going to have a multimodal approach, I think you're correct. There needs to be the appropriate legislation to ensure that sort of influencing doesn't happen within the area of those different voting venues.
Thank you. I think we've got agreement around that point. Councillor Mulholland.
Kia ora, thank you, Mr Mayor. I'd like to acknowledge the team that have done the work on this, Warwick, Rose and other staff. Thank you. So one of the things I've got a question on, which I'm happy to have someone respond later on because it may be complex. So I question the strap line where it says show your love for Auckland by voting. The reason I question this, probably from a background, but does it really impact for people who live in specific wards and areas? One question. As I say, you may like to come back. And will that be used for the September 2020 local body election? Whilst I agree with Councillors Newman and Simpson's comments, I would like to add this question. Or do you want me to continue with that, or do you want to answer the first?
Just put the other question in as well. We'll get them to answer the two together.
So,
thank you.
One-stop shops. It appears I have somewhat of a different opinion in relation to the one-stop shops. Whilst they're positive and do information share, I believe there's anecdotal evidence that I've had from community with regards to the process of the selection of locations in terms of fairness and equity for all candidates and people that are involved, so that we've got the capacity for people to engage and understand what process will be used next term to ensure wider fairness for all candidates in terms of selecting the area where a one-stop shop is. So there was 3 questions. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Thank you. Good questions.
Your Worship, in terms of the branding approach, I'd like to ask Victoria if she would like to comment on that. But there's a whole project to do with marketing research and the sort of messages that go down with people and so on.
Sorry. Through you, Chair. Victoria Walker here. Thank you for your question. In 2019, it was Vote for the Auckland You Love, which was an evolution of Show Your Love for Auckland, which was 2016. both of those statements went through a level of robust review and were based on research that we had in 2015 about the emotional high ground and the positive nature of campaigning for a local body elections, rather than that one we did in 2013 was vote, don't vote, which was a negative insinuation. So that's the genesis, the simple answer to the question as to why it was and whether it resonated. And it resonated in all areas, and there was some tweaking of the messaging when we wanted to talk more about community rather than love.
Thank you. And the other questions?
So will my second part of that question be answered, Mr.
Yeah,
Mayor?
I'm just,
Thank you.
I think
Yeah.
that's going to be picked up by Warwick. Have I got that right?
The selection of locations, I wasn't involved in that process. I'm not sure if we've got an answer to that as to how it happened, but take the point. They need to be locations that convey a sense of fairness to everybody in terms of the spread. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't have the second part of my question with regards to the strapline, which I don't think works incredibly well, but that is a view for myself and a few other locals. My second part of that question was what process will be used and what evaluation will be used, and will this be utilised as a strapline for September 2020? Thank you.
Okay, well, we've got the research. I'd probably ask Warren if we've got any research to date that judges the effectiveness of that campaign. So I would probably need to come back to you, as in the strapline. I probably need to come back to you on that.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd appreciate if someone could come back to me to understand that more for our community.
I think the short answer is also, while I'm sure it was properly researched, that we got a low turnout. So whatever we're doing this time, we can't keep repeating it and hope to get a better turnout, so we need to look at how we might do it differently. We've got two more questions to come. If I just suggest that, because many people have made comments during their questions, our commentary section could be quite short, he says optimistically. Councillor Cooper.
Just a question around when you talked about the effectiveness of polling booth days, have we taken into account the fact that for the last two elections, I think parliamentary elections have an advance voting booth for 2 weeks, which, because we haven't done that, have we? Only parliamentary. And they 79% national turnout, even youth, 69%. So that's what I'm wondering, whether we put that in the mix as an option, because it's working really well. Over 50% of parliamentary voting at the last election, I think it was 50%, was done by advance voting because people have got time. It's not just one day. And now we have our voting in the school holidays, which when the term times changed, we never changed it. And so there's effectively 2 weeks where people have their voting forms and put them on the bench or they're away.
Thank you. Warwick, do you want to comment further on that, please?
Just a short comment. Like, we're aware of the advance voting. It's different legislation. It's not in our legislation. Our legislation provides basically for 3 weeks.
Yeah. We might end up getting the worst of both worlds. We have advanced voting in the sense that you've got the ballot paper there for 4 weeks, but because you've got it there for 3 or 4 weeks, you tend not to utilise it. So I think that's where on the next item on the agenda we need to think about what we're saying to central government about how that system could be done better. Councillor John Watson. Sorry, John.
No question. I'll use my time.
Well, let's move into that as well. And can I just repeat what I said optimistically before? If you have had the chance to make some comments during your question, let's try and keep this a bit narrow because we've got another item pretty much on the same issues. So, John.
So, yeah, ask no question. So I'll just make my comments as concisely as I can. I guess when I look at the report, if you judge the results from the the strategic approach and the outcomes that were sought, clearly it's a non-achieved in NCA parlance. We wanted to get the voter turnout of at least 40%. It was barely 35%. The candidate to number ratio of 3 to 1 was significantly below that, and especially if you take into account the wards and local boards where there were a lot of people stood, meant there were others where they were really beneath that. Excellent user-centric experience, I guess, in the most fundamental part of the voting experience for people that actually go to vote is these forms that everyone finds, including candidates. I mean, you wouldn't bother filling them in if I wasn't standing. I wouldn't bother filling in half of them, because it's a real kind of academic exercise to dutifully go through, read it. If you don't know the people, go through everything. So that in the most fundamental sense, we're off to a shocking start with the forms that are actually given to people. They're clumsy, they put people off voting, yet apparently there's no ability to do anything about that. Similarly with the focus of trying to increase knowledge of the council and the importance of participation, well, that's been a hardy old annual that we've had every year, every single election cycle. And it's not coincidentally enough, our main form of communication is our Auckland, both leading up to the exam, focused on NZDA, yeah.
Like that for candidates.
Yeah, it is an exam. Is our Auckland, so our Auckland, it arrives in this yesterday, so that usually goes in the bin straight away. If you do open it up and you wanted to find out a bit about your council or a local board, as it stands, you always get a fair shot, Phil. You're always there in the front. We always see you. That's good. But if we go further in, you've got one. I'm not blaming you for that. We've got one little clip. This is your ward councillor. This guy Walker. He's always at the top, and this other bloke I've never seen before, and a couple of new people. So that's our communication. That's our communication for most of the year with people who represent 180,000 people. That's their presence. So is it little wonder no one knows who your local board member is or who your councillor is, and that happens every time. So that until that changes, then we're not going to get up another couple of percent either. And I don't want to be misunderstood here. I'm not blaming the people at all who were involved in the election process for the council. They've got an impossible job, and they're not going to turn around that sort of momentum. And the other thing, the other elephant in the room that we don't acknowledge is the super city structure, that's been in Auckland, and it results in a different dynamic. If you go back to the very start of the super city, we had people, public policy professors of AUT, such as Ian Shirley, who unfortunately has passed away now. This was what Professor Shirley said before the council had even started. And I've just scrolled down a bit. Professor Shirley says the Minister of Local Government's plan is a badly conceived strategy that effectively undermines local government in Auckland. It ignores history, fails to connect in any meaningful way with the diverse populations and neighbourhoods in the region, and has established a corporate framework and process that will not gain the trust of ratepayers. And we know that because we conduct our own Citizens Insight survey, which shows our trust and confidence consistently at 19%. So this is a logical outcome of a structure that is essentially, to begin with, despite the best efforts of everyone, has basically alienated a significant part of the population, and that's reinforced by all the polling. So we've got a distinct problem over and above what other local councils have in New Zealand, and trying to combat that structure. However, I would like to commend the people who brought up the youth initiative, the youth voting initiative, and Councillor Walker referred to civic strategy, some sort of civic education, and the lessons that are there are actually quite good. One of them's entitled, "Does Voting Matter?" Does it matter? And if you go through that lesson plan, a little heavy on the verbose side, but if you went through it and you had a teacher that had a little bit of go in them, they could be presenting a very good case to young people why they should bother voting, or why they should tell their parents to vote. So absolutely, civic strategy is required. We've got off to a good start here, and I commend anyone that was involved in that. And if we, part of our population are gone, you're not going to get them back. But the young people, we do have a chance to get in and to try and get them interested in civics, because that's really important. for us as a council and as a country. So I would hope that that continues, and that next edition, I've got a full page spread there, Councillor Watson says, along with Phil. And that'll get voting turnout up to
Thank you,
about
Councillor. That might be
85% in the Albany ward.
That might be an appropriate note to finish on. Okay, we're now into commentary, and just remind people if they can keep their comments reasonably brief, particularly if they've spoken before. Councillor Casey.
Just while you put up the extra words to D, Your Worship, I will talk to them. You should have them. I'm only going to talk once, so if I talk now, I won't talk at the next item, if that's okay with you. So I'll just talk once, and it's on the Maori seats. And thanks, John, for the start of the history lesson. One of the benefits of being a senior councillor is that I've been around a while. And it was 11 years ago in May that there was the biggest hikoi Auckland has ever seen. 7,000 people marched from 3 corners of the region into the city centre to demand Maori seats. So let me talk about the Royal Commission on Auckland Governance, and that was the David Shand, Peter Salmon and Margaret Baisley. They didn't want 1 Maori seat, they didn't want 2 Maori seats. They actually wanted 3. 2 to be elected on the Maori roll and 1 to be appointed by Mana Whenua. 3. What happened? John Key, who was the Prime Minister at the time, and the National Government said no, that Maori would be better represented by an advisory board. Maori in Auckland were very upset. Peter Sharples was the Minister of Maori Affairs at the time, and there was a lot of discussion, a lot of column inches devoted to it. But then there was the hikoi, the likes of which Auckland has never seen and hasn't seen since. Maori were roused to take to the streets. What happened after that? No change. John Key maintained his position that Maori would be better served by an advisory board. Mayor John Banks at the time thought that was a great idea. He thought, and he said in public on TV3, that New Zealand had outgrown apartheid. The Minister of Maori Affairs, Peter Sharples, took issue with Mr. Key and said that it was a treaty obligation. It is a treaty obligation. And since then, we've every 3 years we've had a discussion. And that's why I don't think we've done enough either in this set of resolutions or in the submission to the government to say that we actually, this council, supports in principle the idea of Maori seats. We supported it in 2017 by 10 votes to 5. We had actually a vote. We don't need a vote today because it is supported. If you vote for this, you support it. We do want Maori seats, but we need to actually ask the government to take action. And that doesn't, the words you had up there, Phil, didn't do it for me. So we're firming that up. The action we need, and thank you, Richard Northey and the Waitemata Local Board, 2 things. We want to be like all other councils in the country and increase our membership if that's what we desire, if that's what we need. We should be able to do it. At the moment, we can't. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, as Richard pointed out, is that if council makes a decision, it's a democratic decision by its elected members who are representative of the people. To then suggest that the people can have a poll that overturns that democratic decision is ludicrous, and it's been proved so 5 times in New Zealand. We need to stop this charade and move into a real engagement with our treaty partners, one that's not subject to Hobson's choice politics in the background. And so that's all this is. It's firming up that resolution, which I hope everybody will support, and firming up the submission because it's almost silent on Maori seats. So happy to have your support for, I think, Phil, you're not putting that as an amendment A.
I was just going to suggest, Councillor, as we discussed, I thought that was probably more appropriate for item 10 because we then feed it directly to government. This is just a comment on this section. So I put it up so that we could foreshadow that would be an amendment. I'm happy to second it as a part drafter of it.
Can you just show me what your words are for this resolution?
So it says, seek legislative change to allow Auckland Council to determine the size of its membership consistent with other councils and to allow councils to consider the creation of Maori wards consistent with central government for the 2025 local government elections.
Can it not be in 9 as well? Can it just not be in 9?
I think we'll put it up once. I've foreshadowed it here because it is relevant to this discussion, but if it's an action point, that's what we want to feed into our submission to central government.
Okay.
Okay, with your agreement, you're happy about that. Okay, that's good. Thank you very much, Councillor. Councillor Fletcher.
Thank you, Worship. I think it's appropriate that we are looking at a possible amendment here. I have long been on the record for condemning the good and valuable work of the Royal Commission in looking at bespoke legislation for Auckland. And this is just but one of the changes that were made on the hoof by the then government that I think were wrong in principle. And I think we're dealing with the repercussions of that without actually going, as Councillor Watson said, back to what were flaws with the original legislation and why we have struggled to actually make it work as effectively as it might. So I hope that perhaps you might give consideration, Your Worship, to not just looking at that aspect, but also other aspects of the Royal Commission that I think would have been far more effective than what was subsequently adopted by way of legislation for 2010. I'm really pleased that we've actually taken the time. There's lots of issues that have come up. I'm pleased that Councillor Cooper has raised issues around the fact that we can't have special votes beforehand. I mean, it is patently ridiculous to be conducting this over a school holiday period when we know that so many Auckland families go away in the middle of the year. It's just stupid. One of the things that hasn't been touched on, and given that I'm not standing for the Auckland Council next time, I feel I can talk about it a little more frankly, and I'm raising it on behalf of the younger candidates that I would like to see coming through. But it's just with the 3-week postal ballot period. You'd never do it in central government that you would expect candidates to be out there without a sort of peak day, and both the Mayor and I have experienced central government elections, and you know that you build up to election day. You release your policies, you do certain things, you get your material out, you pay for brochures to be printed, and you work to election day. Instead of that, we expect, and in some cases these are independents, these are people who have never stood for electoral office before, to be out there for 3 weeks, out there putting themselves, with the courage of putting themselves up for public office, taking the criticisms, taking the flack. And I watched over the course of that election period, I watched the toll that it took on people who weren't sort of election seasoned, they weren't election conditioned. And I've been around a long time, but I've got to say that this election, and it did, one of the most dreadful things happened to one of the candidates that I was supporting in the loss of his son through that period. And it made me utterly determined to speak out to say how ridiculous it is that we are expecting people to be out early in the morning to late in the evening, keeping their hoardings up, doing all of the things that they're required to do over that period of time. And I would challenge any one of you around the table to say that you think it's a healthy, sensible way to go about conducting yourself. The other reason that I think it's quite difficult, because we didn't adopt what the Royal Commission were recommending and we had a bodged up alternative, we've created in some ways not just the role of the Mayor, we all know, and John Watson has and the role of the Mayor is really important, but that's all of the public see. But we've got, it's not dissimilar to MMP with Parliament. You've got 2 tiers of members of Parliament. We have 2 tiers of councillors. those that stand in a single ward, a single councillor ward, and they are smaller boundaries. There are fewer people that you have to connect with, and there are those in 2 councillor wards, and those 2 councillor wards are enormous. And it is very, very difficult. And we haven't had a discussion, and I can't raise it today, but it's something I'd just like us to all take on board. It is extremely difficult for those 2 councillor wards to get around. I mean, there are geographical issues, and I'm looking at Councillor Sayers, who's probably thinking, how can you possibly be, I've got the extent of this enormous geographical ward, and the Deputy Mayor would probably say the same in terms of Franklin. But there's a whole range of issues here, really. That's what I want to draw to your attention. And ultimately, if we are to get people that are not just party machines, and we want individuals who will apply their value judgment to the issues that will help grow Auckland, we make it a very, very hard call in terms of getting those people across the line. And I think it's time for us to have a bit of a revolution and a shake-up in the way that we go about it.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Wayne Walker.
First of all, I just want to echo the comments of my fellow councillor, Watson. I think there's a larger context here, and it's not just about disengagement with the elections, it's disengagement across the board. Yeah. If it weren't for the fact that we're actually dressing our engagement up by counting people at events and the like that we have to go to boost the numbers, we would find that our engagement is in progressive decline. And I do not regard that engagement often as genuine. It's simply you're catching somebody when they're having a hot dog, or they're at one of our council events, and that's engagement. And often it's not. It's pretty flippant stuff. So I would like to see a much more scientific, evidence-based approach to our engagement, and to look at the reasons why people are not engaging. I can only operate off the anecdotal evidence that I get, on the basis of meeting with as many people as I can on a one-on-one basis through the process. And they tell me that, well, one, they don't understand the structure. Some of them, when they do start understanding the structure, are even more disenchanted because they then understand the lack of authority that councillors have over the CCO. So there's a double whammy there. They, in my opinion, have less and less civic pride in the council. We have no civic education. When I compare our administration with other cities that I visit, I find that there is no civic access to this civic building. In other locations, you can have wedding photos, you can go on tours, there's history about the city. There is no history about the city that you can find scarcely anywhere. I've got a collection of the books on the City of Auckland. Most of them are quite dated now. We have no induction even for councillors about the history of the city. If I was to ask a multi-choice question of most of the councillors here, I'm sure most of the questions I would ask would generate a very poor reply. And the same goes to the population generally, yet this should be a city that we should all be immensely proud of. But most people know very little about it. As Councillor Watson mentioned, we, as a council, apparently have no civic education in any of our schools. If you look at any of the curriculum, primary, secondary, tertiary, you'll find nothing there. It's an abyss. So it's no wonder that people are not engaging. If we look at what we are doing structurally across the region, and I can only speak for my area, we're flogging off our council building and the civic spaces around it, so that is going to be no more. The same thing is occurring in the North Shore. It's becoming more difficult for people to actually engage against a process where throughout time people have engaged through civic squares, through town halls and so on, and ours are being progressively dismembered. And that's in contrast with other cities that I go to, where the old town halls are still there, they're often celebrated, they're often occupied, there is civic education in libraries, there's material, there's civic pride, there are campaigns. We lack any of that. So I put to you, Mr. Mayor, that this needs to be an ongoing discussion. It's really, really serious, and it's against a larger background globally where there's a general malaise around the democratic process and real concerns. So if ever there is a time for us to act, and the chief executive and the mayor to provide leadership around that, then that is now. And I continue to ask for this, and I continue to ask for a civic strategy. The last time I had the conversation, the chief executive asked me what that was, and I spelt it out in some detail. And I look forward to an agenda item that picks up on that and applies some budget to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Darby.
Thanks, Mayor. It's been a really interesting discussion, actually. It's been quite wide-ranging, lots of points addressed. In some ways, I view this report, as you mentioned, Mayor, at the outset, it's sort of a bit of a perfunctory report, you know, one of those things you have to do, as is the next one. But this is now a chronic issue, and I think you mover and seconder for including the A, because that is the crux of it. And while a lot of the discussion is addressed possible solutions, and it's interesting, we can't get away, we can't hide from that number, 35.3, and going down pretty rapidly. So if you think about democracy and democracy about embracing its population, it's the people of Auckland, we are failing to do that. And it's being reflected every 3 years. I note from some of the research there that 74% of people plan to vote. They were canvassed, they planned to vote, and then only half of them actually did. And the lack of voters in this is reflected in Mr. McNaughton's comment. When I asked him, you know, on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being really super serious, Mr. McNaughton was pretty candid and said, this is more than super serious. This is off the scale. So this is a senior officer from within our organisation telling us, again, that we have to address this problem. We can't just go past this perfunctory report and let it go out the door. It's interesting when you look at voter participation in Auckland. Yep, it's extremely weak, but it's higher across the nation. It's quite high in district councils, regional councils, rural councils. And I'm thinking to myself, no evidence here, but I'm thinking to myself, are they the councils that are connected to their people? You know, the West Coast and Greymouth, they get high turnout. Are they connected to their people? And then I look at parts of Auckland and I go to Aotea Great Barrier, and there's a high turnout there, not just for their local board, but for their council election and for the mayoral election. They feel more connected, maybe. And then there's other parts where there's distinct lack of connection. The real problem seems to be in the metros, and we're the big metro, but we are the big metro that's performing the worst. We've dropped off quite a bit in our voter turnout. And I can't help but think, I'm interested in online voting and all of that, but Mr. McNaughton's just said, yep, but that's no silver bullet, not your words, but you might tweak it 2 or 3% plus, but it's no silver bullet. And I can't help but think at the root of this, and Mr. McNaughton's words were, people's lack of engagement with their council is the root of it all. Now, I don't think that offering from Mr. McNaughton is unfounded. And if you park up a few years and you go back to the Royal Commission of 2008 and 9, there were 2 systemic problems, and one of them was about regional integration. I think we're well on the road to addressing that. But the other systemic problem, remember there were 2 systemic problems. Community engagement is poor. And I think we've lost sight entirely of that systemic problem. It was lost sight of through the legislation, and we are beasts of the legislation. And I don't think the legislative structure of Auckland is helping us one iota in connecting with our communities. We do have tools, and I'm not using that as an excuse, but we've got to go back and look at how we engage with our communities, because my feeling is that that is the root of this. Now, the Parks and Community and Events Committee is now charged, my suggestion, that with community engagement. I don't think this is just some workshops to address voter turnout. I think there is a much bigger issue here that we need to pick up through Councillor Filipaina and Councillor Casey's committee on community engagement as well. This is just the beginning of getting to the root of a very big problem that we have here in Auckland.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Richard Hills.
Thank you. I think, like I said before, the system is broken and it's been broken for a while. We have steadily declined since the 80s, 20% since the 80s, and it's been steady. We had one little blip, and it was the super city elections, potentially because it was so much focus on that, or there was so much change. I'm not sure what is the science behind that, but there was a blip. Everything else has been a steady line from the mid 1980s to now. It's not last election, it's not the election before, it's steady. It's actually a pattern. So this is a similar report to the last 3 years, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but I think part of what my questions were before was agreeing with what Councillor Watson actually was saying, and I didn't get a chance for the question to be answered, but around the engagement across the 3 years. It isn't just about the election. It is about, and it's not about us as politicians individually, but that we don't have the resource to do what Parliament does in sending out information throughout the year about what we're doing, about our community. It's up to all of us, which is great, but as one or two people per ward, as Councillor Fletcher says, to try and get that message out on an annual plan, let alone the things that are going, the roadworks, whatever, we can do it on our community Facebook pages or try and get out as much as we can, but we can't afford to put out our own massive ads throughout the year in the newspapers or get out letters to everyone across. We can't, we could, but I can't imagine any of us wanting to spend $20,000 or $30,000 every couple months to get the message out of our personal income. Parliamentarians have hundreds of thousands of dollars each to have 3 staff in their electoral office at work. I would say we get a lot more constituency questions than MPs do, but they have 3 staff to deal with that. They have a comms plan, they have budgets. I'm not saying we need all that, and the ratepayers don't want us to spend lots of money on that, but I think it does. There is an issue with the 3-year process of suddenly we blip up at the end, hey, here we are, vote for us, and then not by any fault of our own, we can't get the message out in a convincing way over the 3 years, and so people don't have confidence that we actually did what we said, we're saying what we do, and we're showcasing what it is. People said to me, where have you been the last 3 years? And I could probably show them 1,000 ways I thought I was engaging, whether it was libraries, whether it was online, whether it was turning up to 1 million meetings. But that person that went to work and got home at 7 is not coming out to anything I'm putting on, and potentially is not looking at Facebook either. So we think we're engaged, but we're not, and we try our hardest. The issue about what I was trying to say about the central government elections, over 100 million is spent on what is a fairly simple, easy 2-tick process, and we spend between 2 and 5 million on a very complex process across our city that people then also have to figure out how to sign up, get enrolled. The one-stop shops were fantastic, but they weren't easy. To try myself and to set it across to people, here are it's going to be 2 to 5 at this time, and because we were under-resourced and our amazing staff were trying their best to get around the city to do the right thing, they were getting out there and then running out of forms, and election services, I'm not sure of the exact numbers, were charging huge amounts of money randomly outside our budget to get voting forms back to those people. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but that's what I heard. So it wasn't easy. If it was sort of like every night in the same place or once a weekend in the same place, it might have been easier. But us to try and explain to random people, between 2 and 5 here, 5 and 7 here on Sunday, you can get to this, it wasn't easy because we didn't have the resource. So I want to make sure that over this 3 years we ensure we're getting the resource behind this, because if we're true about it, we are going to have to talk to Auckland. What is the price of democracy? What is the price of getting this across? What is the price of people seeing their elected people that they invested in three years ago actually doing the stuff? So the other thing is, and it is about universities, and of course that's an important place to be. Why? Because people who are under 24, under 30 are voting less than half of what people over 65 are voting. That is, everyone's vote is equal, but at the moment we're not getting to certain audiences, other people. And it's also about the fact we talk about ratepayers for 3 years. The amount of people who told me, oh, I don't pay rates, so I can't vote anyway. Or they move houses 3 times during an election and we don't make it easy to enrol. Someone who's been living in the same house for 40 years and knows everything about the local area and gets the letter and knows where the post box or the library is. That's so easy and simple. But we don't make it simple for people who are, so it's very confusing, but I don't think it's your problem. And I don't necessarily think it's only our problem. But I also say it was the most negative campaign ever on an Auckland system I experienced. So that's on us as well to improve that, because people don't like the negativity, the nastiness, and it kind of turns off if that's the only thing they're hearing. So it's complex, but I think it largely is about budget, because I don't think we've got the resource to really do the 3-year job of telling people what is happening in their area.
Thank you, Councillor. Just before I take the last speaker, Shane Henderson, Lotu is here somewhere. Yep. We'll take you directly after we've voted on this item, Lotu. Sorry to keep you waiting. And then I'm going to propose that we break for lunch before we come back and do item number 10, which has some similar themes, but we probably won't need to repeat what we've already said in this discussion. Last speaker, Shane Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and I will be short. Thanks, colleagues. Just wanted to comment on A up there, and really thank you for that. I need to point out that when we're talking about low voter turnout, then there are different communities that are impacted by that. I'm talking about lower turnout up with Māori community, with Pacifica community, obviously with young people, which is canvassed a lot. Lower socioeconomic areas vote lower than higher socioeconomic areas. So that actually has the effect of wealthier communities having more of a say through the ballot box in how the city is run. That's unacceptable. And so as part of looking at the causes of this, I really want us to look at those things.
Thank you very much. That was very brief. I'm not going to try and sum up the debate. It's been a long one, but it's necessarily long because this is a critical issue. But I just want to put a couple of things out there. If I was asked the 2 most important things for the low turnout, I would say lack of candidate knowledge, and I would add belief that it matters. So if we're brutally frank about it, those are the things that I get fed back when I tackle people about whether they've voted, they haven't voted, or why they think it's low. There are other things that we can do to improve it. The voting system is one, and I think if I go back to what Warwick said about the making the voting experience easier and less complex, I do want to emphasise 25% of people started filling out the ballot and never completed. And what my suspicion is, Mayor, Councillor, yeah, okay, local board, a little bit harder, maybe not quite so visible, but okay. Then they probably got to the licensing trust or the district health board, and they thought, as they've referred back to me, we don't know what they do, and we don't know who the people are. And at that point, a whole lot of people said, this is just too tough, I won't bother. So, when we look about what we want to say to government, maybe we've got to press for that voting experience, easy at the central government level, 1 vote, although this year probably a couple of referenda just to make it more interesting. This is a whole lot more complex, so we can address that aspect as well. I do want to mention the civics argument. We ought to be proud that we live in a democracy, and we ought to acknowledge that that gives us rights and it gives us responsibilities. But I've talked to a whole lot of people, hey, do we ever teach this at school? Does school prepare kids to participate as citizens in their society? And the answer is no. Actually, when you turn up as an MP to a school, mostly they say, well, please don't be political. You can't take, you do need to, people right from the start of their life need to know this is how a democracy works. Yes, there's disagreement, there's argument, there's different points of view. I'd like to see something done more in that area as well. I think John Watson's point's an appropriate one. It's not about visibility of the candidates just during the campaign, it's about the 3 years. And once upon a time, when we had, local newspapers with local reporters, we probably got a better go at it. We tend not to have that now. But if I went back to the knowledge of candidates, belief that it matters, actually, if we want people to take local government seriously, then government has got to consider how it funds and what it devolves in terms of decision making to the local level. Because if people don't think it matters, then they won't vote. So that's some thoughts from myself on that. I just want to refer now to the recommendations. We've put A up because I think it needed to be there, and I want to thank Councillor Darby for his input into that. We need to emphasise that we have got a huge problem. It's not just Auckland's problem. It's right across the country, and we need to do something about that. And I think, when we discuss this again on Monday, I think actually making sure that REMU is doing the research, but we're also plugging into what the other groups around the country, whether it be Auckland University of Technology, are doing, and what they may add to our discussion on the basis of their research. B and C are about single transferable vote or first past the post. I don't think we've had any discussion about that, and that indicates to me that councillors probably haven't changed their mind since our last decision not to change the system. D is and E relates to the 2022 elections, and that will be superseded by the foreshadowed motion through Cathy Casey on the 2025 elections about our control over the size of our body and the consistency with other councils in that regard, and the consistency with government in terms of Maori representation. We're not asking for anything other than consistency. I think that's a pretty powerful argument. The representation arrangements, obviously we have to do that every 6 years. This is not the time when we start looking at how we might alter boundaries. So unless there's any request to the contrary, I'll put A to G.
I thought you had Councillor Casey's as an amendment. It's in the...
So on the next item, I'm sorry.
So it's been quite a hard chain to follow for the last...
No, let me just again explain that. I appreciate the time. That the next item is about what we are submitting to government, and therefore it's more appropriate on that item. Okay? Good as gold. Everybody happy to vote as a group?
As long as we can, if there's individual ones we disagree with,
you can notify, as always, councillor. So all those in favour, please say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. Carried. Can I thank officers